Thanks very much for the introduction. The topic for the next, I think, not 2 days, but 20 minutes is how to find the bridge from scenarios to strategies. And that will start with two introductive questions. How to cope generally with the future and how to develop future scenarios. If we have these two basics, we will take a closer look on this bridge between scenarios and strategies. And we will end up with a summary and a short look on the success factors for scenario-based strategy processes. So I guess there are a few hundred different definitions of what strategy is, and a very simple one, but one that might help us in general, is that a strategy is the way into the future. And if within this seminar we ask the question why strategies fail, my answer would be very often they do because we fail in coping with the future. And if we take a look on how companies and organizations cope with the future, there are three different levels, so to say. The traditional way is to explain the future with the past, to use a lot of data and to extrapolate that into the future. That works well in short term, but leads to problems still in midterm and in situations where you face a lot of changes. So there's a second level where you identify the future within current changes. That leads to the term trends, which is the usual tool we use in future processes as well as in strategy processes. But there's a third level, and that's the one I would like to talk about. That's the level of scenarios, where we foresee different futures and where we cope with uncertainty. And these scenarios are based on two different kinds of thinking. And the first of that is future open thinking, which means that we have to think about the future without predicting it exactly. You see some failed prognosis on the left side of the screen, which show that even a lot of experts fail in foreseeing the future. There's a second basic, and that is systems thinking. That has something to do with this early market research study from Daimler on the left side of the screen, where they argued that worldwide demand for cars will never exceed 1 million, primarily because of a limitation in the number of available chauffeurs. That shows that it's even a correct chauffeur prognosis system would not be the solution in such a situation. We have to overcome linear ways of thinking. We have to overcome a too narrow approach, and we have to understand the interactions within complex systems. And if we combine these two approaches, then we come to the definition of a scenario, because it describes one possible situation in the future that is based on a consistent set of developments of the most important key factors. And if we use these scenarios in strategy processes, then we come to the term scenario management that we usually use to describe the process I would like to talk about. And that leads to the second question, how to develop these future scenarios. And, the first and important point is that we have to be aware a scenario is not a strategy. Usually we talk about external scenarios. They describe possible site conditions, the world around us. They deliver something like a weather report for our business. And such a process starts with, let's say, a radar screen to make sure that we do not look on one side of our environment only, that we really integrate the different areas. And if we have such a radar screen, we could collect different influence factors. And that usually leads to a long list of influence factors which need to be reduced to a number of, let's say, 15 or 20 key factors. And these key factors could be seen as our questions about the future, the things we want to know. And the second step, we take a look on each single key factor and ask ourselves, how could it develop? What is imaginable? And at the end of this process, the interim result looks a little bit like this. We have a lot of different building blocks, and they need to be combined to scenarios. And at this point, you could differ between two approaches in scenario development. There's the traditional scenario planning approach. This is more a top-down approach following an intuitive logic. And there's the more systematic approach, a bottom-up approach with a model-based logic. And if you follow this second approach, you combine the different projections to scenarios based on consistencies, not on probabilities. And that leads to description of the different elements of such a scenario, and then the scenarios could really be described. And an important point is that you have not only the single scenarios as a result, you get also a map of the future, something that visualizes the different possibilities how the future might develop. And following this scenario development, you could ask yourself, where do we stand today and what are possible paths into the future? And that is the difference between scenario development on the left side and scenario assessment on the right side. And if we have these scenarios, then we could ask the question, what does it mean for our company? So once again, the scenario is not a strategy. It's a tool to develop better, let's say, to develop robust strategies. And usually you have a situation like this. You have, let's say, 5 different scenarios. And then you have to ask yourself, what are the driving forces in a specific scenario? What changes? Who wins, who loses? What are indicators that make you become aware of changes in this direction? And you could ask yourself, what are the opportunities and threats for us in this specific scenario? What should we do if? And then it's highly important that you do this not only for the very, very nice dark blue scenario number 2, you do it also for the, let's say, ugly brown scenario number 1. You have to do it for all the different scenarios. And by doing so, you get access to the very different options that you have. And usually there are 2 extremes you have to be aware of. One extreme is that you focus, you concentrate yourself and your strategic measures on one specific reference scenario. But if you do so, you have to make sure that there is a necessity for strategic early warning. That is one extreme. The other extreme is a strategy which fits to all the different weather conditions. This is what we call a future robust strategy, but you would have to use a lot of more resources for such an approach. So that in practice, at this point, you take a look on the scenario assessment. And if you do so, you might end up with a result like this, where you say, oh, I expect more scenario 2, 3, and 4 to come true. And if you do so, these 3 scenarios would be what we call the relevant scenarios. And relevant in a way that they define the overall objective for the strategic guideline. And of course, in such a process, you also add the strategic analysis, and you could then formulate the strategy with all the different elements. For, I guess, every one of you will have different approaches to how to formulate such a strategy. That is, let's say, the first way and traditional way to bridge scenarios and strategies. Second way is to develop what we call strategy scenarios. As I mentioned in the beginning, external scenarios usually describe possible site conditions. But there's a second kind of scenarios, and this is what we call the strategy scenarios. They are not external, they are internal scenarios. They describe our own futures. They represent our window of possibilities. The interesting point is that you could use more or less the same methodology to come to these internal scenarios. You could identify what we call strategy elements, the internal key factors. You could look into the future and ask yourself, how could, for instance, such a product portfolio develop? And you could combine that to strategy scenarios. And if you have done this, if you have developed external scenarios on one side and the internal strategy scenarios on the other side, you get such a little matrix. And in that matrix, you could ask yourself how suitable a specific strategy scenario, like D here, is in an environment described by a specific external scenario. And this is an approach you could easily use even in a management board, for example, so that you get such a matrix and you could read the matrix from different perspectives. You could ask yourself, if the world develops in a way described in the external scenario number 2, what are suitable strategies? And you could also ask yourself, if we talk about strategy scenario B, how robust is it? And where would we face difficulties within this strategy? And so that in general, this is very an approach which gives you the possibility to really discuss the long-term direction of a company or of an organization. So if we think about how to bridge scenarios and strategies, we often start with the external scenarios and we assess them. And we change the perspective to the strategy scenarios, and very often we ask the participants to evaluate their preferred strategies. And based on this, we combine the 2 sets of scenarios in such a future matrix. Then we have 3 basics for the discussion of the strategic guideline: the external market expectations, the internal preferences, and the combination of the strategies. So summarizing this, I would like to draw your attention on 6 success factors. And the first one is that we have to understand scenario thinking as the basis for a successful scenario process. So it's nice to have a good tool, but you need a good methodology to use it. And it's nice to have a good scenario methodology, but the most important way is to stimulate the people to think in alternative scenarios. That's the first point. The second point is that we should use scenarios to combine the future knowledge within our organization. So successfully used scenarios are developed by the organization and not for the organization. The third point is that within a process we strive, let's say, for a double goal. One single scenario, it could be seen as a coffee table book. It delivers a vivid image of one possible future, something which makes us imagine how the world might develop. And on the other hand, a set of scenarios that could be seen as a map of the future. It shows the window of possibilities, and we should bring these 2 perspectives together. The success factor number 4 is that we have to differ between scenario development and scenario assessment. So within a scenario development process, all scenarios are seen as thinking tools, and we do not look on probabilities. But if we hand over to the scenario assessment, we are looking for a snapshot of the current perception of the future, and that includes our expectations. So that makes scenarios move from a thinking tool up to a planning tool. Number 5 has something to do with the balance between the focusing and the robustness, as I described it. So a focus strategy is a little bit like a telephoto lens, where you reduce the perspective to one expected future. The robust strategy is more like a panorama lens, where you take different future developments into account. And successful strategists need, you could say, a well-filled photo bag with different objectives, so that they could cope with different levels of uncertainty. My last point is that we should take advantage of all scenarios. Even if we reduce our focus, strategically relevant scenarios are a basis for our strategies, for roadmaps, even for planning activities. But that's not all. We have to be aware that there are some strategy critical scenarios, and we should not forget them. We should use them as a basis for strategic early warning processes. Yeah, so that's my point for how to bridge scenarios and strategies. And I could say thank you for your attention and wish you all an inspiring webinar. Thank you.